In this episode of Chinese Steam Locomotives, I will go over the history of the largest, most powerful steam locomotives ever produced to run in China, the QJ Class 210-2 locomotive. I will also go over the history of its predecessor, the just as large but nowhere near as powerful Russian FD 210-2 class. I will start this video chronologically with the Russian FD Class 210-2s first. These were imported into China in the late 1950s as there was a massive need in China for more locomotives and bigger, more powerful engines in particular. China had several locomotive builders by this point, but they were preoccupied with building JF and JS Class 282s and the SL6 and RM Class 462s, so other options had to be considered for locomotive building. An agreement was made with the USSR to import over 1,000 1930s Soviet FD Class 210-2s for use in China. They started arriving in 1958 and had to be re-gauged from 5-foot to standard gauge. These engines pulled the majority of China's mainline freight until the 1980s when the QJ 210-2 class was introduced. The last FD to run in mainline freight was in October 1985. The FD class was pretty disappointing to the Chinese. Although it was a fairly large and heavy engine, it was not particularly powerful and was closer to the pulling power of a JS Class 282, and they were not very well liked by the Chinese engine crews. There are two known FDs that are preserved in China today, FD 1227 and FD 1979, and a third was put aside for museum display but has not been seen since 2001. Apparently there are several preserved FDs in Russia. Now on to the much more successful, powerful, and well-loved QJ Class 210-2 steam locomotives. Nearly half of the locomotives built in China were QJs, and over 4,700 of these engines were built. The design of the QJ was derived from German 210-Os captured by the Soviets in World War II. They were found to be very powerful and reliable engines, much more so than the FD 210-2s. The Russians were very impressed with the class, and they soon designed their own 210-Os, the L class, and they were built from 1945 until 1955. After the L class, the Russians developed the LV class. They were very similar to the L class, but had a larger firebox and a 210-2 configuration instead of a 210-0. These were built between 1954 and 1956, and 522 were built. After this class, the OR-21 class was being developed. However, in 1955, the Soviets decided to modernize their rail system to diesel and electric power. so the class was abandoned. The first of the OR class was being built when the decision was made, and this would become the QJ class. At the time, the USSR was assisting China with drawings and tools needed to build the OR class that they no longer needed with the decision to modernize. It was several years before the Chinese would actually start production on the new locomotives, but between 1956 and 1960, 42 prototype QJs were produced by 6 Chinese manufacturers. The first production QJ was not finished until 1964, and production then continued until 1988. By that year, 4,714 QJs had been built, and all of them, with the exception of 24, were built in the Chinese Datong shops. Apparently some QJs had oblong smokestacks, while some had standard round ones, depending on when they were built. Also, apparently, some had 4-wheel tender trucks, while others had 6-wheel trucks, and no 8-wheel tenders were made after 1982, other than the 4 broad gauge engines built in 1985 for switching duties that had to cross the Mongolian border. Tests were conducted in the 1980s to fit the engines with gas producer combustion systems, or GPCS. 2 engines tested this, and it never went any further than that. They were both converted back to coal at some point later. The class was originally called the HP class, then FD class, but this was confusing with the Russian 210-2s having the same class name. In the end, the locomotives would be reclassed again to the QJ class in 1971, QJ meaning advanced class. Between the mid-1960s and the late 1980s, the QJs were the main motive power on Chinese main lines and pulled the majority of the country's mainline freights and a lot of branch line freight. They also powered much of China's passenger trains, especially express trains. However, by 1997, the class had lost much of its mainline dominance to new diesel locomotives. Sadly, many of the older QJ class were scrapped, and by 1991 there were no more than 1,000 QJs still in service. The official last steam locomotive to pull a mainline train was in March 2002. Some QJs still were used up until the mid-2003. The 1990s gave the QJs new life as industrial and local rail lines were able to buy several newly rebuilt QJs for the price of one new diesel. However, by 2005, the last QJ stronghold in Inner Mongolia fell to diesels. In some of the coal mining regions, QJs continued to operate for several years, along with JS and SY Class 282s. But the decline of steam continued until the last steam locomotive, a JS 282, saw fire in early 2022. Many QJs only ran for 10 to 15 years. Some saw service for 20 to 25 years. However, many were scrapped after only 10 or 15 years of service, and by 2010, QJs were a very rare sight in China. Several QJs were preserved, QJ0001 and QJ0004. They were both prototypes, and the very first production QJ, QJ101, was also preserved. QJ1337 is the only other QJ on display in China. Several others are in storage at the CNR shops, but are not visible to the public. 2 QJs were imported into the U.S. in 2008, QJ6988 and QJ7081, and they are owned by the Iowa Interstate Railroad. These were operated in excursion service for a number of years, but now need 1472-day inspections to run again. Both engines were in full Chinese colors and lettering when they arrived and first ran in the U.S. However, QJ6988 has since been heavily Americanized with the removal of the shrouding around the smokestack and the addition of a U.S. bell on the front of the smoke box and full black paint job. I think the engine looks far better like this. One other QJ is in the U.S. QJ7040 was purchased by R.J. Corman in 2007 and was transported to its new home in Kentucky and first ran in the U.S. in 2008. It is currently at the Kentucky Rail Heritage Center awaiting restoration. The QJ class is officially the last steam locomotive class designed and actually built, and was one of the last classes to run in revenue service anywhere in the entire world, only being outdone by the SY and the JS Class 282s. The QJ class remains one of the most significant classes of steam locomotives for the country of China, and if any of the 3 in the U.S. get rebuilt, that legacy can live on. While I may prefer the JF and SY Class 282s, the QJ will remain the powerhouse of the Chinese steam fleet. Thank you for watching. The pictures and videos in this production were all slides, postcards that I own, and some video that I took from Train Simulator where you can run QJs.